Shalom, family. Good to see you all here. Hope you're doing well. We're going to talk about all this stuff that Donald Trump is doing. He has taken over two oil vessels that belong to Venezuela. And one of the countries that Venezuela sends their oil to is Cuba. And they've been helping Cuba out a lot over the years. In fact, they give them oil at a very cheap rate because they've been struggling so bad. So Maduro has really bent over backwards to try to help the Cubans. Well, now that the two vessels have been taken over by the US, they haven't been making it over to Cuba at all. They literally have gone out and become pirates out in the sea, the US, and they are holding these oil vessels. Well, Cuba, which was already in a very fragile state, said this act alone will collapse their nation. They heavily depend on that oil to get by. And I want to hold on. I'm not going to read this whole article, but I am going to kind of pinpoint some of the things that's going on. So hold on. I'm going to share my screen with you, and then we'll get into the videos. Okay, so this came out in the Wall Street Journal, ladies and gentlemen. And I started reading it, and I did not realize people are literally running off of that island right now in droves. They said a quarter of Cuba is already gone. People are running because they can't survive there. So let's get into it. I'm not going to read the whole article. I'm just going to read certain portions of it. Wow, look at that trash pile up right there. It's crazy. So Cubans are going hungry, suffering from spreading disease and sleeping outdoors with no electricity to power fans. And they said it's been very hot there at night, very hot. So a quarter of the population has fled during the island's most prolonged economic crisis. So they have gone without power for quite some time. And Maduro, he actually helped them keep the country afloat by giving them oil at a cheap price. Well, there's now a blockade because the US is grabbing these vessels, and they have been seized from going over to Cuba now. And Cuba is admitting that if they don't get this oil within a very short period of time, Cuba's economy will collapse without this oil. So they've been having a lot of problems with their energy on that island. So, I mean, these folks are running, and Donald Trump is deporting people back there. And the people are running out of there. I don't know how that's going to work out. And it didn't really get heavily into where they're going. I mean, they could be going to other islands, but they're definitely getting out of there because they said they can't make it. So Venezuela was giving them 100,000 barrels of oil was shipped to Cuba daily. And the heavily subsidized oil shipments have fallen to 30,000 barrels per day. That's a steep drop. So, oh well, they're having a lot of problems, and I don't know how these people are going to make it with no power, and they can't feed themselves. Yeah, they're in a desperation, a state of desperation. But I want y'all to remember how those Cubans treated our people down there in Florida, especially when they first came. Oh, they never stop acting like their shit didn't stink, and they still act like that to this very day. So, yeah, but Cuba was never really in the best of shape, y'all. They've had embargoes on them. That's why they're still driving cars from the 1950s, because they can't bring newer cars in there because of the embargoes. They're not driving those cars because they like it. They're driving those cars because they can't get newer cars in there. That's why they got to keep those 1950 style cars going the best that they can. They won't have anything else to fall back on. So, yeah, so it looks really bad for them. So let me stop. I'm going to stop sharing this article, and I'm going to, let me see, let me get the videos up for you to watch. Yeah. But yeah, so, Maduro and Cuba, they're mad at the US. They're messing up the game. They're messing up the game. So Cuba already said they cannot survive a long period of time without this oil. So I don't know what's going to happen. I know they're not going to let those oil vessels go. The US, they're not going to let them go. Y'all give me a 1 if you can see my screen. Thank you.
The empire is scrambling to fully dominate Latin America, and other notes. U.S. forces have seized an oil tanker carrying some 1.8 million barrels of oil from Venezuela to Cuba as part of its ongoing series of warmongering escalations against the Maduro government. When asked what would be done with the oil, President Trump told the press, "We keep it, I guess." Meanwhile, Chuck Schumer is refusing to oppose Trump's regime change interventionism against Venezuela, and CNN just had on former U.S. intelligence official Beth Sanner to proclaim that the Trump administration's act of piracy is absolutely normal. So Trump's ostensible opposition in the political media class are putting absolutely no inertia on this. The U.S. pirating a Cuba-bound oil tanker from Venezuela illustrates how the empire is hurrying to shore up control over Latin America in the same way the U.S. and Israel are quickly shoring up control over the Middle East. There's a window of opportunity to shove through a bunch of pre-existing military agendas in both regions, and they're aggressively seizing it before their attention has to turn to bigger geopolitical fish. You often hear U.S. imperialists saying that obtaining regime change in Venezuela will help achieve it in Cuba as well. Senator Rick Scott recently told 60 Minutes that if Maduro is successfully ousted, quote, "it'll be the end of Cuba," and that America is going to take care of the Southern Hemisphere and make sure there's freedom and democracy. Stealing the oil hurts both Cuba and Venezuela, who are the two primary enemies of the U.S. empire in the Americas because of their strongly socialist governments. They got a right-wing government into Bolivia this year, and now they're hurrying to push regime change in Caracas and Havana, while they've got a right-wing tyrant in office with a Gusano Secretary of State. The hope is to force the entirety of Latin America into full alignment with the empire before Trump leaves office. I have no idea if they'll succeed. The U.S. House and Senate have agreed to make registration for the draft automatic, which will simplify the drafting process if the empire decides to throw the youth of America into a horrific new military conflict. The US is making its biggest draft policy change in 45 years, so it's easier to force Americans to fight and die in a massive war, just as the New York Times editorial board launches a series explaining why the US must prepare for war with China. The latest edition of the New York Times' arguments for the need for more U.S. militarism is titled, "This is the 21st Century Arms Race. Can America Keep Up?" which argues that, quote, Congress needs to expand funding for research and development into technologies with military applications. The editorial board writes, to counter the growing threat, America must simultaneously win the race to build autonomous weapons and lead the world in controlling them. Fun times. The BBC is reportedly training its staff that it is anti-Semitic for anyone to oppose Zionism, because most Jews identify as Zionists. You see,
The U.S. Coast Guard is locked in on another oil tanker after seizing a second vessel off the coast of Venezuela this weekend, which the White House says contained sanctioned oil. And a U.S. official now says the Coast Guard is in active pursuit of a sanctioned dark fleet vessel that is part of Venezuela's illegal sanctions evasion. If it catches up with the tanker, it would be the third such seizure this month. Administration officials have promised to continue the campaign after. The president announced last week a full blockade of all sanctioned vessels going into or out of Venezuela. There's growing bipartisan concern about the end goal of the military action, especially as the president said in an interview Friday he would not rule out war against Venezuela. But some Trump allies are voicing support for the ramped-up efforts to pressure the Maduro regime, which called this weekend's seizure theft and kidnapping. In a new CBS News poll, 73% of respondents said Trump has not clearly explained the use of possible military action against Venezuela. And domestically, Americans are also looking for more from the president on pocketbook issues, with only 37% approving his handling of the economy. The president looked again to highlight his economic accomplishments with a video message at a Turning Point USA conference Sunday.
We're making America affordable again with big wage gains and falling prices for gasoline, energy, mortgages, groceries, and other pillars of the American dream.
The U.S. Coast Guard is actively seeking another oil tanker near the Caribbean in Venezuela. This comes from U.S. seizing an oil tanker called Century 2 weeks ago. U.S. officials is linking this to Venezuela's efforts to evade U.S. sanctions. U.S. officials also say this as well, that these vessels are part of Venezuela's shadow fleets that moves oil in violation of U.S. sanctions. President Trump announced a blockade. Basically, is under sanction to choke off the regime's oil revenue. He also demands Venezuela to return oil assets that Venezuela seized from U.S. oil companies decades ago. What do y'all think? My name is Tiffany. I lost 150 pounds in 2.5 years, and I also report different news topics as such today. Tap in.
I don't know, America. I think you're doing just a little bit too much, okay? Now we have piracy on the high seas. Not a good look. Not a good look. You're messing up our reputation.
So the U.S. just intercepted a Venezuelan oil tanker and seized the boat that was on its way to Cuba. This is absolutely illegal. This is an act of piracy. Remember when Yemen was seizing boats because it was trying to stop the Israeli genocide, and the U.S. wouldn't allow that to happen, and yet we're doing it right now. The U.S. is pushing for a war in Venezuela, trying to provoke Maduro. We see now it has absolutely nothing to do with drugs. It's all about regime change. 70% of the American public are against U.S. intervention in Venezuela. Our government needs to listen to us and stop these provocations. Leave Venezuela alone. Hands off.
This is Marco Rubio, who has a personal vendetta against Venezuela and Cuba. This tanker was going to give vital oil to the island of Cuba that's under a 70-year sanction and embargo by the United States. I want to know what's going on with the crew of the boat. The crew of the boat, that's called kidnapping. These are hostages that the United States has. This is just must be called out for what it is. U.S. aggression on Venezuela, on Cuba, and we need to keep the zone of peace peaceful.
Hands off Venezuela.
Hands off Venezuela.
The Wall Street Journal has reported that if, in fact, the cheap oil that's been flowing from Venezuela to Cuba were to dry up, that could collapse the Cuban regime as well. One Cuban exile in Texas, who's at the University of Texas at Austin there, has been quoted saying that that outcome would collapse the Cuban economy. What would happen at that point in your mind?
Well, I think that Cubans will finally have the opportunity to be free. They haven't tasted freedom in upwards of 60, 70 plus years. And that would be something that would be in the interest of the United States. There's always going to be uncertainty when that happens. We saw Eastern Europe, which most of those nations now are on a path to prosperity. And it takes decades when you throw off an authoritarian regime. But I would love nothing more. And I've been dreaming my entire life of a Cuba Libre. I mean, a free Cuba. And I'd like to see a free Venezuela as well. This is a Monroe Doctrine. It's 200 years old. We want to take care of our hemisphere first. And this would be something that, President Trump's putting heat on these authoritarians because he paints with bold colors, not soft pastels.
Congressman, thanks for answering such a breadth of questions for us tonight. I want to take a deeper dive into the narco-terrorism aspect and the strikes on these suspected trafficking vessels.
I love that we just seized a giant oil tanker like it's going to fix anything. It's all theater. Gas prices won't even blink.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. It ain't gonna be no added bonus for us. You can best believe that. We still gonna be dealing with all this inflation. So we shall see. Yeah, Marco Rubio is Cuban. Yes, he is. Yes, he is, but he's a sellout. He's a sellout. They're deporting his own people and he says nothing. So he's a sellout. Yeah, he is. He is. But what the United States better remember is y'all don't win wars anymore. Y'all don't win wars. And you may think this is an easy one for you to defeat, but I remember y'all said that about Iraq and Afghanistan, and look at how that turned out. I remember when that first happened, I was working and people were saying, oh, we'll win that war in 2 weeks. It ain't nothing but a bunch of rocky mountains over there. Those people are in the Stone Ages. Well, you didn't beat them people in the Stone Ages, did you? You didn't beat them. So y'all can sit around and say whatever you want. Yeah, they want to take over Cuba. You can tell. They want to take over. They're waiting for it to collapse, and then they want to run in there and take the whole thing over. That's the goal. They want that place to collapse, y'all. They want it to. If they did not want that to happen, there's no way they would be withholding the oil that they know they heavily depend on. So the fact that they're withholding it, they want it to collapse over there. And then you'll hear all them billionaires talking about going in there and taking it over and putting their luxury hotels and all that out there. Yeah, that's what they're going to turn it into. It's going to turn into a big tourism site. That's all. They want that land. Anything, because, listen how Donald Trump talks about Canada becoming the 51st state and they going to take over Panama, the Panama Canal. This man is about land grabs. That's all he's about. That's all he talks about. Greenland. And even Greenland had to tell him off. And the Danish, they're the ones that own Greenland. And Donald Trump talking about he going to take Greenland. Just take Greenland. And then he said the same thing about Gaza. Oh, that's prime real estate. We can turn that place into, a hotel, a resort, and all this stuff. That's all this man got on his mind. He's a true colonizer by heart, for real. Yep. So we shall see, but it don't look good for Cuba. Anytime the people are fleeing in droves, they see the writing on the wall. They know things don't look good at all. They're running. And yeah, I mean, if you go X amount of time with no electricity, how you gonna cook? How you gonna feed yourself? Those people are probably in a desperate state. And how many stores are gonna be open? They probably can use some generators depending on the size of the store, but that's a tough thing to go through. So even if you're able to buy things from the store, you can't get anything that you need to refrigerate or put in a freezer because you just won't be able to do those things. Hospitals, schools for the kids. Yeah, I mean, it just completely disrupts their entire way of life. Mhm. Yeah, that's all these billionaires, they see dollar signs. We see people starving and people fleeing. The billionaires, they see dollar signs. Oh, how they can take over the island and make so much money. So, everybody, I'm going to go ahead and conclude. I have one more live that will probably come up like about 8 o'clock, and it's going to be on the added nations that are banned from coming to the US in the Caribbean and Africa, because Donald Trump ain't going to pick any white nation. He's going to pick wherever there's melanated people. Those are the only countries he want to keep out. Project, because they're working on, they're enforcing Project 2026. It's not just Project 2025. There's also a Project 2026. So they're enacting all this stuff. And who knows what's going to happen in January, because isn't the deadline for the government uh, shutdown? It could possibly be another government shutdown in January. Because I think they only funded up until January, correct? So this place may be looking at another government shutdown when January come. They don't care. They're purposely trying to ruin the place. Donald Trump think he's doing it himself. No, honey, the Most High is controlling your ass. So, y'all, I'm going to go ahead and conclude. I will see you at 8 o'clock. Shalom, family.